Every idea must be tested. Every claim, no matter how sacred, how comforting, or how ancient, must stand before reason. Last time, we applied the consistency test. And what we discovered was uncomfortable, because even the most revered definition of God collapsed under its own contradictions. But logic alone isn't the full story. There's another test, deeper and more human, a test that doesn't measure equations or paradoxes, but conscience. This is the morality test. A claim passes this test only if it aligns with the principles we recognize as just, compassionate, and fair. Not because we invented them, but because they define what goodness means. If God is the ultimate moral authority, the source of all right and wrong, then his actions, his commands, and the world he governs should represent the highest imaginable standard of goodness. No excuses, no contradictions, no mysteries that redefine cruelty as kindness. So here's the question. When we apply morality's own criteria, does the God of Scripture pass his own test? Or does he fail, not by opinion, but by his own moral standard? That's what we're about to find out. And before we begin this next test, pause for a moment. If you believe that truth deserves consistency, if you think morality should never be exempt from examination, then support this work. Like the video, subscribe for the next test, and share this with someone who still believes that goodness requires faith instead of evidence, because the next few minutes may redefine what good really means. The morality test begins now. Before we can test divine morality, we need to define it. What does moral perfection actually mean? Not in poetic terms, not in hymns or sermons, but in the language of reason. A morally perfect being would have to be consistent, never calling cruelty good in one case and evil in another. It would have to be impartial, judging all beings by the same standard, without favoritism, tribe, or belief. It would have to be proportionate, ensuring that justice fits the act, never infinite punishment for finite mistakes. It would have to be compassionate, choosing mercy when harm serves no purpose. And above all, it would have to be responsible, never allowing preventable suffering when the power to stop it exists. That's what moral perfection means. Consistency, impartiality, proportionality, compassion, responsibility. These aren't human inventions. They're the foundation of every moral system we've ever built. The common thread that allows us to call something right or wrong. And morality, by definition, cannot contradict itself. If an action would be evil when committed by us, it cannot become good when committed by a deity. If genocide, slavery, or torture are moral abominations in human hands, they cannot be divine virtues in God's. A morally perfect being cannot excuse injustice, cannot demand cruelty, cannot inflict suffering without reason. So here are the parameters for our test. First, consistency, with the moral principles preached to humans. Second, proportional justice, that fits the act, not the ego of the ruler. Third, the absence of unnecessary harm. These are the criteria by which we'll measure the divine claim of moral perfection, because if a being fails these tests, it cannot be called good, no matter how powerful it is. Let's see how the God of Scripture performs under these moral criteria. If the morality test is about justice, compassion, and fairness, then the first place we must look is Scripture itself. Because the earliest stories of God are not parables of peace. They are chronicles of Gashuran violence. carried out not by devils, but by the divine. The problem appears immediately: a being called perfectly good, commanding mass slaughter. Let's start with the most famous example: the flood. According to the story, humanity became corrupt, so God decided not to reform it, but to erase it. Every man, every woman, every child, every infant, every animal that walked the earth, all drowned, except one family. This isn't moral correction, it's total annihilation, a genocide by water. And the question isn't, could God do it? The question is, why would a morally perfect being choose to? Were infants moral agents deserving death? Did newborns understand corruption? Did animals deserve punishment for human sin? Proportionality collapses here. Compassion disappears entirely. Now, let's move to the Amalekites. In the book of Samuel, God commands Saul, "Slay every man, woman, child, and infant. Do not spare them. Kill the ox and the donkey." Not soldiers, not criminals. An entire population, executed without exception. By any human standard, this is an atrocity. By divine command, it becomes holy war. A moral being distinguishes between guilt and innocence. But these verses blur that line until nothing human remains. Even more chilling, the act isn't regretted. It's celebrated as obedience. Saul is condemned not for killing too many, but for sparing too few. The message is clear. Mercy is rebellion. Next, the Egyptian plagues. One man, Pharaoh, refuses to release the Israelites, but God doesn't punish the tyrant alone. He punishes an entire nation. He floods their rivers with blood. He sends disease, famine, and death, and ends it with the slaughter of every firstborn child in Egypt. From palace to peasant, from guilty to innocent, no distinction is made. It's collective punishment, a moral crime in every ethical system we know. And to make it worse, Scripture says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, ensuring his refusal, so that the plagues could continue. He manufactures disobedience, then punishes the people for it. If this were any human leader, we'd call it cruelty. But when it's divine, we call it justice. That's the double standard. We condemn human atrocities, but sanctify them when attributed to heaven. We tell ourselves, there must be a reason. That divine morality must work by rules we can't understand. But morality that cannot be understood cannot guide. And goodness that requires slaughter isn't goodness at all. The God who commands genocide fails every criterion of moral perfection. He violates consistency, compassion, and proportional justice. He punishes the innocent. He rewards blind obedience. He glorifies suffering as virtue. By our own moral definitions, and by the very definitions religion itself gives, these are not acts of righteousness. They are moral catastrophes, and no appeal to mystery can erase that. If a human being committed these acts, we'd call them monstrous. But when God does it, we call him holy. That's not morality. That's moral surrender. But maybe, defenders say, these were ancient times, primitive eras, and humanity's understanding of goodness was still evolving. Maybe the violence of the Old Testament was a phase, a shadow of a deeper truth still to come. So let's test that. Let's move forward in the story and see if the New Testament, the so-called revelation of divine love, can pass the morality test any better. If the Old Testament failed the morality test through violence, the New Testament fails it through sacrifice, because at the heart of Christian theology lies a simple but devastating idea. God demands blood for forgiveness. And when none of us could provide blood pure enough, he decided to kill himself, to satisfy himself. It sounds profound. It sounds loving, until you analyze it. The moral paradox is this: an innocent being suffers in place of the guilty. Justice is achieved through scapegoating. Someone commits the crime. Someone else pays the price. In any human court, that would be corruption. In any moral system, that would be injustice. We call it atonement. The story says humanity was condemned from birth, born guilty, broken by nature, unworthy of love unless someone dies for us. So the Creator sends His Son, Himself, to be tortured and executed so that the same being who demanded blood can feel satisfied enough to forgive the world He created broken. Pause there. A moral being doesn't need blood to forgive. A loving parent doesn't torture one child to spare another. This is the logic of ancient ritual morality. Tribal sacrifice, appeasement through suffering. And yet, it's still called perfect love. You are born guilty, it says, but you must love the one who punished himself for you. It's emotional blackmail disguised as devotion, a morality of debt, where gratitude is measured in guilt. But here's the deeper issue. If justice can be transferred, if innocence can suffer for guilt, then morality loses all meaning. Because justice, by definition, is personal. It demands that each act, each consequence, belongs to the one who committed it. Punishing the innocent to absolve the guilty is not justice, it's inversion. And the symbolism only deepens the contradiction. If God's nature is unchanging, if He is eternally good, then why does He need violence to express forgiveness? Why does mercy require murder? Why does perfection demand pain? The cross may be powerful as a story of love and sacrifice, but as a moral principle, it collapses. It sanctifies suffering as necessary. It glorifies violence as holy. It turns blood into currency. And yet, we call this the pinnacle of goodness. But moral progress, real moral progress, means leaving behind the ethics of the altar. We no longer burn animals to cleanse sin. We no longer stone our neighbors for disobedience. We no longer believe that pain purifies. Human morality evolved. We learned that compassion doesn't need cruelty, that forgiveness doesn't need blood, that love doesn't demand death. So ask yourself, if moral progress means moving away from blood justice, then what does it say that divine morality is still defined by it? A system that glorifies substitutional suffering and calls it perfect justice fails the morality test completely. Because morality that requires a corpse to function was never morality to begin with. And if the New Testament was meant to redeem the failures of the Old, then the experiment has failed again, just in a different form. The theology of sacrifice doesn't elevate morality. It fossilizes it. It keeps us chained to a primitive logic where pain is purity and guilt is love. And if that is the highest expression of divine goodness, then goodness itself needs saving. If morality means compassion, then suffering is its sharpest test, because every moment, every second, the world is crying. A child gasping through bone cancer. A mother watching her newborn starve in a drought. A city crushed beneath an earthquake it never deserved. If God is perfectly good and infinitely powerful, then every one of these cries is a question about moral responsibility. The principle is simple. If you can prevent harm at no cost to yourself, you have a moral duty to do so. A person who sees a drowning child and could save them easily, but chooses not to, isn't good. They're guilty. And this is where the hot drowning child analogy exposes the silence of heaven, because every day, millions of children are drowning, not in ponds, but in disease, famine, disaster. And an all-powerful, all-good being could save them all with less effort than a breath. Yet the world remains filled with screams. Defenders say, suffering builds character, or pain teaches lessons. But what lesson requires a 5-year-old to die of leukemia? What wisdom demands infants buried under rubble? Would we call any human being good for standing by while such pain unfolded, fully capable of stopping it and doing nothing? If we wouldn't, why do we call it divine? A morally perfect being would not need suffering to achieve goodness. And if he does, then goodness itself has lost its meaning. What makes the paradox even darker is the selectivity of divine action. We're told of miracles. One child healed, one crash survivor pulled from the wreckage, one person's cancer inexplicably gone. But for every miracle story, millions are left behind. If God intervenes sometimes, then he is not unable. He is choosing who lives and who dies, choosing whose prayer gets answered and whose doesn't. That's not justice. That's moral lottery. Selective mercy isn't moral perfection. It's randomness dressed in reverence. If a firefighter ran into a burning building and saved only one child, while dozens more burned alive, no one would praise his selectivity. They'd question his morality. And yet we call divine selectivity grace. The suffering paradox is simple. If God can prevent pain and chooses not to, he fails the moral responsibility principle. If he cannot prevent it, he fails omnipotence. Either way, the perfection collapses, because moral goodness cannot coexist with apathy, and omnibenevolence cannot coexist with silence. If power and love are infinite, suffering should be minimal, not universal. But the data of existence tells another story. A world overflowing with preventable pain, a heaven silent to its own creation's agony. That's not mystery. That's moral evidence. And it points to one conclusion. Selective mercy is not moral perfection. It's moral failure. But defenders say otherwise. They argue that morality itself comes from God, that without him, there can be no right or wrong. So let's test that claim next. Defenders say morality comes from God, that without him, there is no right or wrong. But philosophy asked a question 2,000 years ago that shattered that claim forever. It came from Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro, and it goes like this. Is something good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's good? It sounds simple, but hidden inside is a trap that no theology can escape. If something is good because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary. Goodness becomes whatever God happens to like. If he commands kindness today, it's good. If he commands cruelty tomorrow, it's still good. Simply because he said so. That means morality has no substance of its own. It's not about compassion, or justice, or fairness. It's about obedience. In this view, morality is nothing more than divine preference, and goodness itself loses all meaning. But if God commands something, because it's good, then goodness exists. Independently of God. He's merely recognizing it, not defining it. And if that's true, then morality doesn't come from divine command at all. It stands on its own. Either way, the God equals morality claim collapses, Because if good is whatever God says, it's arbitrary. And if good exists outside of God, He's not its source. Both paths lead away from divine authority. Ask yourself this: if God declared cruelty good tomorrow, would it suddenly become moral? If your answer is no, then you already believe morality stands above divine command. You already recognize a higher standard, one that even God would have to obey to remain good. That standard is reason, empathy, fairness, the universal logic of well-being. Goodness isn't defined by power. It's defined by how actions affect conscious beings, by whether they create flourishing or suffering. And that truth doesn't require a throne in the sky. It requires only understanding. The moral test reveals that genuine goodness must stand on reason and empathy, not divine decree. Because if morality depends on authority, it ceases to be morality. It becomes submission. And once morality is independent, the entire foundation of divine moral authority collapses. When divine morality fails the test, most believers don't abandon the idea. They protect it. They rebuild it with excuses, layer by layer, until contradiction starts to look like faith. This is cognitive dissonance, the mind's way of protecting a belief that can't survive the evidence. When Scripture shows cruelty, they say, God's ways are higher than ours. When prayers go unanswered, they say, we can't understand His plan. When atrocities are commanded, they say, there must be a reason we can't see. But think about what this logic does. Every evil becomes excusable. Every horror becomes mysterious. Every moral contradiction becomes proof of holiness. If God kills, it's justice. If He spares, it's mercy. If He does nothing, it's wisdom. No matter what happens, the conclusion never changes. And when a belief system can explain everything, it explains nothing. Morality becomes meaningless when it can be stretched to justify any act, no matter how cruel. This is how faith transforms contradiction into devotion. It teaches followers to trust even when trust contradicts reason, to love even what they would hate in anyone else. That's not morality. That's obedience. It's the same psychology found in every authoritarian system: unquestioning loyalty, blind submission, the belief that power defines rightness. When people believe goodness flows from authority, they'll call anything commanded from above moral. And that's how morality gets corrupted. Throughout history, that pattern has repeated itself, from holy wars to witch trials to modern extremism. The justification is always the same: God wills it. But the moment you allow divine will to replace moral reasoning, you no longer have ethics. You have obedience masquerading as virtue. Because the morality test doesn't just apply to gods. It applies to us, to how we judge, how we justify, how we excuse. And it fails whenever believers defend in God what they would condemn in any human being. We'd call it evil in a man, but we call it holy in a deity. That's the double standard. The moment morality stops being about right and wrong and starts being about loyalty. But even if the stories fail, even if the contradictions multiply, defenders still insist that morality itself needs God to exist. So let's test that next. If morality doesn't come from God, then where does it come from? Look at history. Look at us. Human morality has evolved, not through divine command, but through understanding. Once, ethics was tribal. Obedience to the gods meant loyalty to the tribe. Goodness was defined by what kept your group alive, and everyone else could be enslaved, silenced, or destroyed. But something remarkable happened. As human knowledge grew, so did empathy. We began to see others not as outsiders, but as fellow beings who could feel pain and joy just like us. And that simple realization became the foundation of moral progress. The abolition of slavery didn't come from divine revelation. It came from human conscience, from people who looked at chains and said, "This is wrong." The movement for equality, for women's rights, for racial justice, for animal welfare, each one rose not because religion demanded it, but often, in spite of her knee, religion's resistance. Every major moral breakthrough in history has been driven by reason, compassion, and courage, not by fear of divine punishment. Philosophers like Hume showed that morality begins in empathy, our instinct to care about others. Kant argued that moral law lives within human reason, the ability to act by principles we'd want universalized. And today, neuroscience confirms it. The circuits for compassion, fairness, and cooperation are built into our brains. We are wired for empathy. We are capable of goodness without needing permission from above. This is a higher secular moral realism. The idea that moral truths are real, not because a God declared them, but because they reflect the well-being of conscious beings. Kindness reduces suffering. Justice promotes stability. Fairness sustains cooperation. These aren't divine decrees. They're survival strategies that became ethical principles. And as our understanding deepened, our circle of compassion expanded, first to family, then to tribe, then to nation, and now, potentially, to every sentient life. Morality is not fixed in stone tablets. It evolves, just like we do. We no longer need a divine command to tell us not to kill, or not to steal, or not to lie. We understand those truths because we've lived them. We've seen the suffering that follows when we ignore them. Morality did not descend from heaven. It rose from empathy. It is the quiet miracle of human consciousness. Our ability to care, to reason, to choose compassion over cruelty. And that power belongs entirely to us. So what does the failed test teach us? So where does all this leave us? After 9 sections of analysis, reflection, and uncomfortable truth, what does the morality test reveal? The results are clear. Divine commands contradict moral logic. Divine justice is disproportionate. Divine mercy is selective. Divine responsibility is absent. Every attribute that was supposed to define moral perfection fails the very standards it demands from us. A being that fails every principle of moral evaluation cannot be the source of morality. And yet, this conclusion is not despair. It's liberation. Because when the myth of divine morality collapses, morality itself doesn't disappear. It finally stands on its own. The collapse of divine authority isn't the death of goodness. It's the birth of responsibility. For thousands of years, we've outsourced our conscience to heaven, waiting for commandments, for punishments, for approval. But morality never lived there. It's been here all along, in the human heart, in empathy, in reason, in the quiet voice that says, "This is right, this is wrong." When God fails the morality test, morality itself survives, stronger, clearer, and finally our own. Because goodness doesn't need omnipotence. It needs understanding. It needs courage. It needs us. So before this test ends, take a moment to share it. If you believe morality should be tested as honestly as faith, if you believe goodness deserves truth more than obedience, then like the video, subscribe for the next test, and share it with someone who still believes that morality must flow down from above. Because the test results are in, and morality belongs to us.